Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to our second ArtTech Conversation with the ETH AI Center, the ETHZ Central Hub for Artificial Intelligence. My name is Muriel Siki, and I will be leading the session today. The theme of our conversation is art and artificial intelligence. We are honored to have two experts with us today. They will each give us a short presentation, and you will then be able to ask your questions. Let me first introduce Nora Al-Badri, who is a multidisciplinary and conceptual media artist with a German and Iraqi background. She lives and works in Berlin, graduated in political science at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. Her practice focuses on the politics and the liberating potential of new technologies, such as machine intelligence or data sculpting. It is very thought-provoking and puts in question post-colonialism and the inherent power structures. Also with us is Adrian Notz, curator at the ETH AI Center at the Tichy-Ocam Foundation, mentor for the creative strategy and vision at the European Center for Contemporary Art in Cluj, and Chevalier de la Tombe de Bakunin. From 2012 to 2019, he was artistic director of the famous Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. He was also head of the Department for Fine Arts at the School of Design in St. Gallen. He has organized and curated numerous exhibitions, events, conferences, and interventions with international art activists and thinkers. He is currently on a research trip to Bangladesh and India, where he is giving several conferences, and he speaks to us from Goa today. Hello, Adrian. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, dear Natalie, for the invitation to be talking here for the ArtTech Conversations. Thank you, dear Muriel, for the lovely introduction. I will talk shortly about the idea of AI and art and my take on it from machine drawings to machine learning. Since October 2021, Nora and I have been working at the ETH AI Center together with the mission, to say it very simple, to bring art into the context of scientific and technological research and development of AI foundations and applications, and therefore strengthen the focus on an interdisciplinary co-evolving AI. And when we, that is the AI Center, talk about AI applications, and over here I'm copying our boss Alex Ilic, the CEO of the AI Center, we mean research and engineering in fields like AI for good and sustainability, industrial and manufacturing, education and the future of work, augmented reality, the metaverse and human-centered AI, digital health and medical AI, finance, legal tech and digital services, robotics, autonomous systems, and AI as an assistance in the research of science and engineering, and in retail for smart cities and mobility. The foundations, the so-called foundations of AI, are theory, that is mainly the mathematical formula background of AI systems, methods, and AI methods like natural neural networks and deep learning, and AI systems currently. These foundations are often referred to as black box, where we are still trying to understand what exactly is happening in the models that are used, and where a lot of theory needs to be done. Generally, one can say that AI is the science and engineering of building systems that solve tasks commonly associated with requiring human-level intelligence. A famous example is the AlphaGo. That was the first computer program to defeat a professional human Go player, a world champion in fact, and therefore became arguably the strongest Go player in history. Also, computer vision, the visual perception of computers, is a big topic in the AI applications, for example, as you all know, in the context of self-driving cars, or also in medical research, making diagnosis. And being here in India, I often wonder if maybe self-driving cars would actually work better in places like Dhaka, for example, in Bangladesh, where I just came from, because there the traffic is totally relies on reaction and entanglement with each other. It is a complex swarm intelligence that does not follow traffic signs, which quite often can lead to wrong interpretations because a sticker is on the sign, for example. There's also the topic of NLP, natural language processing or natural language understanding, which is also an application we see every day, like in the context of translation, to use a very simple example. And at the moment, the research on complex decision-making, that is reasoning and planning in AI, is still very difficult task for the AI technology, while, as I learned in a lecture recently, and in that sense, a little bit surprisingly for me and our art context, while intuition and perception seems to be far easier for an AI. And the researchers in that lecture tell us that reasoning is driven by high-level intuition, which I think is a nice, good, almost poetic philosophical sentence. In this context, the mission of the ETH AI Center is to lead the way towards trustworthy, accessible, and inclusive artificial intelligence for the benefit of society. Accessible and inclusive AI means that AI technologies are not only understandable and interpretable, but also easy to use. That is, with no or at least low costs involved. In this sense, as I can see from our fellows and faculties, there is a high interest in sharing these new technologies and research discoveries and making them as accessible as possible for everyone. Trustworthy AI then deals with the question of AI applications being robust, lawful, and ethical. Trustworthy AI research is following 4 ethical principles that were set up only 3 years ago by an expert group on artificial intelligence from the EU Commission in their ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. These 4 ethical principles are respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness and explicability. These principles then also lead to 7 requirements in the realization of trustworthy AI, which are human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. Or in short, as one other paper on the topic mentions, a decent AI. So researchers and engineers are currently working under high pressure on the question how abstract and almost philosophical notions like individual rights, fairness, robustness, trust, causality, bias, norms, interpretability, and explainability can become part of AI programming. The ETH AI Center therefore wants to create an environment for the pursuit of trustworthy AI systems and serendipitous collaborations across AI foundations, applications, implications, and impact areas. Therefore, there are currently 120 faculties connected to the AI Center with over 200 postdoc researchers and more than 1,200 PhD students. Alone, this big interest from all the 16 departments of the ETH Zurich shows how pressing the topic is, from research to engineering to startups and to industry. We have currently 25 ETH AI Center fellows. And over here, as you can see in this slide, again from Alex Illich, the CEO of AI Center, there's most of them or all of them have 2 different mentors in their research from different fields with equal weight in supervision. So here again, we have this idea that transdisciplinary research is, encouraged. Another field is the one of entrepreneurship and startups. So the ETH AI Center also has a program which is called Talent Kick, which is there to help students who are leaving university to found their startups. And Talent Kick will help find a co-founder with a complementary skill set and get hands-on experience as an entrepreneur for the students. During the program, one lays a stable foundation for oneself to confidently decide for the entrepreneurial career path of the studies. So we might ask in this whole context, what role could art play in this context? And for this, we need to go back in history, like we artists or art historians like to do quite a lot, at least in terms of art in Europe and the so-called Western modern world. We can go back and look at the facade of the ETH main building, where we actually find three today commonly understood as artists. There's Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Albert Dürer. But back then, all three of them, or mainly Da Vinci and Dürer, were also considered as artists and scientists and also technologists, because Da Vinci, for example, created a lot of his ideas, or tried to create a lot of his ideas himself. So the real problem actually starts a little bit later, like almost 250 years later, for us European modern individualists. And one could say it started in Switzerland in the year 1763, when philosopher and activist Jean-Jacques Rousseau was lying in a rowing boat in the lake of Bienne, Biel. And over there, while trying not to think, he then discovered that it was still thinking within himself, and therefore coined this idea of the self, or the subject, or the individuum. So there's something over there which then led further on to this notion of genius, creativity, and other topics commonly associated with the authorship and the artist as such. And in the same time also, we have the rise of Romanticism and the beginning of industrialization. So industrialization led to a massive alienation, so to say, of the modern Western European human being. And we can see this yearning and longing in a lot of paintings of the Romantic time. Here, for example, Caspar David Friedrich, Kreidefels nach Rügen, a very famous painting, where actually the idea was always to reconnect with nature, to become, instead of the machine, more human again, to become, in that sense, instead of rational, to become to get into the realm of aesthetics. And also, one could say, in view of civilization, to get maybe back into the wild, or into the indigenous, or the native. Also at the Lake of Bienne, that is also part of the Jura region, where absinthe is produced and where a great part of Swiss watchmaking comes from, another technology in that sense. You can find the first anarchist organization that was formed, the first international anarchist organization, which was called Jura Fédération, of which Mikhail Bakunin, one of the great grandfathers of anarchism, was part of. It could be nice, therefore, if you take this context, to think of AI also meaning anarchist intelligence. With this, it is not about total chaos, even if that is necessary to create a new and better order, like in deep self-learning neural networks, but also about mutual aid, voluntary association, self-organization, like anarchist, activist, anthropologist David Graeber like to define anarchism. Therefore, basically an order that anthropologists find in many indigenous native communities, and that also inspired Rousseau to talk about equality, freedom, and brotherhood in the romantic times. The only non-anarchist move would be that there should be a ruler, given that the ruler is the human in the loop. So AI can be total chaos, but and create a new order, but it needs the ruler of us humans, especially when we look at biases in AI systems. If we jump again another 50 years, we get into the context of the First World War in Europe, where you have machines killing people. It was the first war with mass destruction machines like tanks, cannons, planes, submarines, gas bombs, and so on. And in this context, we find my old heroes, the Dadaists, where the founder of Gabriel Voltaire in 1915 already wrote, quote, "The war is based on a glaring error. People have been confused with the machines. One should decimate the machines instead of the people. Later, when the machines march by themselves and alone, it will be more in order. Then, with good reason, the whole world will cheer when they smash each other to pieces." This is mainly for the context of the European Dadaists, like Hugo Ball, here in spite of this, or in sight of this context of the First World War, aspiring to become more kind of mystic and nonsensical in his art. And also in this context, we have Hans Arp, Jean Arp, who discovered another potentially, I would say, AI function, the idea of randomness as a creative or artistic tool, where, as far as I remember, like 20, 25 years ago, the discovery of the random algorithm, or the creation of the random algorithm that would then create swarm intelligences, was a big discovery. So if you want, we can also look at certain artistic strategies and try and find them again 100 years later in AI applications. This skepticism for machines was basically a European thing, one could say, because they were in the middle of the First World War. But across the Atlantic, when Francis Picabia arrived in New York and saw the progress that machines could bring, also Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, who was already there, a lot of them embraced the machine and the idea of the machine. And Picabia, as an example, then also started doing so-called machine drawings. Here we can see fille née sans mère. So it's a daughter born without a mother, the machine. And for them, and for Picabia even, he said that maybe it is even the soul, or the human soul, that is shown in the machine. So it has had an almost metaphysical dimension. Similar, it is also then again in Europe after the First World War, where you had first influences of the Russian futurists like Tatlin, where here Georges Gauss and John Hartfield showed a sign which says, "Die Kunst ist tot, es lebe die neue Maschinenkunst, art is dead, long live the new art, the new machine art of Tatlin." So here we have again machine art, or machines in that sense, as a kind of tool to go beyond the contemporary art context of that time. Another nice example is Raoul Hausmann's Mechanical Head, the spirit of our time, which, if we look back from today, could be even understood almost as a kind of cyborg version, or as a very rude or a crude model of a BCI, for brain computer interface, where you have this applications put onto the head, and maybe it can be like an extension of the human's thinking. For Raoul Hausmann, the idea was that it's kind of, you externalize the thought, you bring it out onto the outsides of the head. And also the Dadaists in Berlin had this idea of becoming automatons, so of becoming machines themselves, to basically make humans better. Another approach from the artists of that time was, as one could see with suprematism and also Russian futurism, was in sight of this fast technological development, was to say, we will go beyond technology. So we don't just join it, but we will actually try and be even more radical than the technological progress that was happening at the time. Here we have Kazimir Malevich's Black Square, which back then was understood as the icon of the modern or of modernity, in the sense that on the one side, on a philosophical or ideological one, you could say that the icons, if you talk about Orthodox icons in Christianity, God had disappeared, and now there was enough space, an open black space to the cosmos. But also on the other side, this open black space, the darkness, the possibility and the potential for everything was a way of going beyond technological progress. So to conclude a little bit, one could say that art can inspire scientists to ask new questions. Over here, I'm showing the example of an artist duo from Zurich, Christina Hemauer and Roman Keller, with whom I worked in 2015, where they started a project based on a cyanometer. That was a tool to measure the blueness of the sky. And back then they asked scientists if the sky in the future will be bluer or less blue. So the good news is it will be bluer, but the bad news is that it's actually, I think, because of pollution. Currently, they are at the CERN in the residency, which is called Arts at CERN. And over here, they ask these questions with the scientists. Is like, why is aesthetics not a parameter that is researched on in science and technology? So why does the blueness of the sky, just as a color, as an aesthetic phenomena, not play a role in their research? So maybe this question can trigger new questions of other scientific relevance. Then if you take Raoul Hausmann's head, but also science fiction authors, other visionary artists, or at least artists understood as visionary today, one can also say that art can give visions and fictions of and for the future. So on the one side, if you have sci-fi writers, sci-fi artists creating visions of maybe the present and maybe also the future, quite often technology also sees that and how to say, adapts it and starts actually developing things into the future, which basically is a realization of this sci-fi inventions by artists and writers. So maybe the inventors of augmented reality glasses or of BCIs had seen Raoul Hausmann's head and thought this could be a way to move forward. But there are also more concrete and better examples for this. And another point which I would like to make is from the Netflix series Abstract, where in the second season, Mary Oxman is presented with the MIT Media Lab and the material ecology. And she then shows this diagram where you have basically science researching and developing new technologies that are then implemented by engineering, which then again are utilized and in that sense made usable for humans with design, where again an aesthetic dimension comes in. And then one could say, or at least in this idea, the idea of how these new products are perceived, how basically technology is influencing our lives, not only technology, but also this then as a kind of critical questioning of our society can lead back into scientific research. So what we are doing at the ETH AI Center, Nora and I, is basically we are working on 3 levels. One is on AI and art education. That is that we want to try and bring together on a student level, students from, let's say, computer science or fine arts, as we just did in a seminar, with the question of what AI do we want? So the idea is to have this transdisciplinary approach in a maybe very radical way already on a student level, Then we would like to build up art and science fellowships of 1 or 2 years, where we would like to have artists there researching on certain AI applications, using them for their artistic projects, but also AI discourses and let's say ethical and philosophical questions on alongside with the engineering and science fellows that are already there. And then on a third level, that's maybe a part of mediation to organize talks and events on the topic of AI, like we're doing right now, for example, but also to have like smaller scale projects where we can use the skills and the knowledge and the technologies that are researched and developed at the ETH AI Center for artistic projects. So, for example, one can say a mix between the fellowship and the artistic project is what we're currently doing with Nora and her deepfake art project. So with this, I would like to hand over the screen or the mic to Nora to give us an insight into her AI and art practice, a deep learning insight. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so what I can do now from here, because he gave us a very good overview, like historically, and also what we're actually doing currently at the AI Center, what's our role in the AI and art program, is I would like to do a deep dive more into what it actually means for specific artistic practices. And I'll talk mainly about one recent project of mine. This is the Babylonian Vision and Neuronal Ancestral Sculptures series. Maybe in the end, I can also talk about a new project that we are developing around deepfakes and ethics of AI and the museum. And yeah, but let me start briefly with a more general introduction of my artistic practice and why I'm here and why I'm applying actually AI, because often I'm using the term cultural big data. That means digital artifacts or fossils also that are represented in our museums worldwide, and their data and what we can do with it, I'd like to call it techno heritage. And for me, it is in a lot of cases more the afterlife of the object, of the museum object, that interests me. And one important aspect of my work is the decolonial, on which I will focus also today. And I will briefly show you that recent piece. The Babylonian Vision series, I realized with the help of machine learning experts at EPFL University, actually at a residency with Nega Forutan and Melika Bejati. And what we did was we scraped databases, from the largest collections, all of them, of course, in the global north, of Mesopotamian, Neo-Sumerian and Assyrian artifacts. And what we got was around 10,000 images. And this is the input data, so to speak, that we use to train a neural network later on then. And what is important, I think, here is why are we doing this? And it's a more a visual practice, of course, and more visual computing. And this process was designed more to yield abstract insights into the search for a visual language of a form and pattern that usually sits in the museums or in the archives of the museums, like Babylonian and Mesopotamian patterns. And this is something AI are really good at. And for me, this was more an approach towards a more speculative, and even like Adrian also referred already to it, more in anarchic archaeology, actually. So after the input, it's important to know that the neural network is, of course, seeing not a single image, but only numbers, as described on this slide here. But the visual museum database, it contains the images of the original artifacts, and they can be used to train the generative adversarial networks. That's what it's called, GANs in short. And the input images of these databases, as you saw them, they are already carrying time and memory themselves. They are already with patina, or they are consisting of broken pieces. And what is happening then is this is a new form of image making we are talking about, based on machine learning, with a latent space that for new synthetic images, that the neural network is actually opening up for us. And what that artistically and from an art theoretical point means, I'll explain in a moment. But if you train the network with, for example, 100,000 human portraits, it will abstract the concept of a portrait and generate new ones. It will not just remix it. It will understand a portrait has of a human 2 eyes, usually 1 nose, 1 mouth, and in a certain order. And the same, of course, goes for museum artifacts. And this is what you can see here. This is the process of the iterations and the training of the neural network. And then after this is happening, and this takes some kind of computing power, not too much anymore though, then those objects are coming out of it. And this GANs and their generated aesthetics, of course, certainly they challenge our understanding and I would say even obsessions with authenticity and originality and even authorship. As Nora Khan wrote on our perception of generated images, that understanding of the process actually helps us to enter how provocative this method of image creation is. And with this understanding, we can linger, analyzing, close reading the image flow for forms and symbols and meaning. And that's what we did. And of course, we can ask ourselves, what is the relation between image making and GANs? And where is this secret latent space that many people are actually talking in the moment about? And what does it really mean? And I would say GANs, they could be a start of even a new paradigm in making pictures. And this is also my fellow artist colleague, Casey Reyes, pointed that out even 2 years ago already. And I think it's important to know that there is no magic involved, only numbers. There is nothing uncanny or dreamy to see here. Those are the words that I usually use to describe the images that will come out of it and the videos I'll share with you in a moment. But for this very reason, but what we can grasp, I think, from this latent space is even more fascinating, because it's the unexpected that we can find subjective and interpretative, like an essence of many, many images, a mood without a frame, recalling the infinite, which is actually interesting because it's a way of image making for the Mesopotamians themselves. And I'll read the quote from Zainab Bahrani. For the ancient Mesopotamians, an immediate encounter with the past was possible through the images and artifacts of antiquity, not because works of art represented in a secondary or removed manner historical or mythological scenes kept in collections, but because of the very direct encounter with the past itself. And this is also what I can share and tell you about this piece and the collections, to engage with them, to activate their ghosts even. So the produced images that I'll go through them now, they can be even photorealistic, but they are not photos, because each one of them is made up from the noise of hundreds of epochs. It's the generator's repetition of learning via the discriminator. This is how the technology works, by the neural network. And of course, one could say, like, how new and original are these images really? Is this verisimilitude, and does that even matter? And there are even larger questions, I think, when it comes to what knowledge and forms in the arts are as passed on through the generations and how we are inspired by them. So for this reason, the output images are something that I refer to as ancestral in the title of the pieces. And what we can see through the GANs here, that are basically the semantics of very large visual data sets that otherwise we as humans cannot dig in that manner. And in the latent space, there is semantic content, I'd say, that has meaning for the human eye and mind, and that resonates. That was my hypothesis for this work. After all, what is it at issue is the meaning that we give to data by ourselves, personally, very subjective. And it's important to control or foresee the latent space because it's a space of the unknown and unseen, of an accumulation of visual epistemologies or even knowledge systems. And the abstraction of the output allows us to contemplate the images and their languages as a form of visual memory, not limited to the input objects, but I'd say a memory that transcends them, and which is even able to generate new memory objects. And My contention here is therefore that machine learning is seen as a technology that is actually performing and processing our collective memory. And it absolutely makes sense to apply it to big cultural data of the past to generate and to give rise to original synthetic images. But of course, how will we use and shape technology and to make sense of our own culture? I think machine learning makes certain patterns visible, including those that we didn't know about, even societal patterns, and those that are not talked about, like the theorist Wendy Chan in her essay Queering Homophily, she describes how machine learning can often offer, and I quote, the generative power of discomfort. And I think discomfort is indissociable from decolonization, and therefore for me it is a very interesting and relevant conceptual tool to use machine learning as a basis, as a tool for new artworks. But of course, another important aspect that I try to address, and maybe one side note, because I'm half Iraqi, this is one of the more biographical, autobiographical artworks I did so far. All the pieces we collected are in Mesopotamia, that is today's Iraq, in that specific area. And Iraq is usually known for destruction and war, and therefore we wanted to contribute something positive, something more future-looking. Even though when you think about it, when usually we talk about AI, it's discussed as a very futuristic technology, but what it actually can do is it only looks into the past. But for this kind of projects, that's exactly what I was looking for, and this is also the interesting part of it and what it can do so well. But what you see here on this slide is another important aspect that I try to address in my work here is the question of representation in data sets that I use to train AI. So today, data sets are trained with millions of images, governed mainly by large corporations because it's very expensive and you need a lot of infrastructure and processing power for it. So for example, ImageNet or Open Images, what you see here, 80% of their content originates from the global north. And that is, of course, it's a visual hegemony. And I'd say, yes, while not being seen may often be a very big advantage in the surveillance age, it can also lead to being, again, dominated by Western visual culture. So the machinic abstraction, in most cases, it's also, of course, in many cases, oversimplifying reality. And I think we are missing a lot. And this is also one aspect that is important for decolonizing technology or thinking, decolonial critical thinking here, is that the diversity of the world is infinite. It is a diversity of very distinct knowledge systems, modes of being, thinking, and feeling, of interacting with the world, ways of conceiving time and the relations among various species even. But now what we see, usually much of it is more like an automated essentialization. So it just goes back to a few parameters that a few people decided are important for the neural networks. And I think this is something that will change in the future and will definitely be challenged by maybe more local and critical and maybe even more smaller applications for AI systems, AI-based systems. But also, I think as of today, Adrian mentioned it too, many people refer to AI as a black box system, and that's problematic because it doesn't show its workings, and it is almost impossible to reverse its input data from its outputs. And this can be very harmful, for example, because of privacy and bias issues, but it has also turned into an advantage in the case of my project here. Ironically, the chosen museums, because I asked them to share the digital data of their collections with me, none of them complied. They didn't want to share it, and this is a big discussion in the open culture community and open data community. Except for one museum that already has an open API, that's the Metropolitan Museum from the United States. So now this black box thing has turned into an advantage in the case of my project because ironically, the chosen museums cannot make a case a legal case against me in this form of image creation, because they will never be able to prove which data sets were actually used for the training. But I can say definitely those from the largest Mesopotamian and Babylonian collections in the global north. So in this manner, the adversarial and the GANs is the decolonial. And in many instances, the black box is a problem, but in some, this can be, well, I think, very, very emancipatory and magnificent. And maybe I'll stop here for a moment and later we can talk. I can share with you a little bit what I'm doing now at the AI Center as a new artistic project, discussing more the ethical aspects for synthetic video creation like deepfakes. Thanks so much, and let the data dance.
Thank you, Nora. We will just go to questions then. I will start first maybe with a question that maybe both of you can answer. You've both touched upon this, but if you can tell us a little bit more about it, about your vision of artificial intelligence and of science in the art world, and specifically at the ETH AI Center, because it seems like in the future we will see more and more of it, no?
Yes, of course we will. I mean, yeah, we will see more and more of artificial intelligence. So the question was like, what is our vision for art with artificial intelligence? Or also the other way around, what could be the vision of having art in the field of artificial intelligence? I think like for art, it might just be like another tool. I think also Nora emphasized that a little bit in her talk. And of course you have new possibilities. But in that sense, the other day I was asked if it would be something like a renaissance of art, which I don't think. I don't think it will change the whole structure of the art world that drastically. So yeah, so I guess it's a nice new tool that can be used. But if we look at it the other way around, like what does art have in the context of artificial intelligence? What is it? How do you say? What role can it have over there? That's also something that Nora emphasized, and also maybe you heard it in my talk. I don't know. Is that I think with art we can have like we can ask different questions, and art at the moment has also this very let's say critical or activist stance, where of course you will then start talking about the other forms of knowledge, not just artistic knowledge, but also indigenous knowledge and other knowledge systems. So I think in that sense, we can like open up the scope of what intelligence actually means in the development of an AI system. And sometimes I jokingly also like to say that maybe our goal is, if you take Ray Kurzweil and his AI singularity, maybe the goal of art is just to make, when the AI takes over, that it might need like 2 microseconds longer to solve artistic problems, because they're not so clearly and easily and digitally understandable.
True. Yes, I mean, I don't know, I'm very biased towards art and technology, because that's what I love and what I do. But if you look at AI for artists as a tool, I think it's even more fascinating than any technology that has been there before, because the data sets, they are kind of mirroring a collective consciousness from the world of around them, a world of sensors that is delivering it to the AI as input data or training data. That's what it's called. And this is just an extra layer towards, usually when you work with a like camera, then you have the technology of the camera, you have to understand that the same is true for machine learning if you want to work with it in a clever and interesting and even challenging way as an artist or as a creative. But there is the extra layer of what the neural networks actually absorb and what they are based on and what they are working with. And I think this is super fascinating, and as I quoted Wendy Chan, this is like, can create a discomfort. It can also create really new insights into societal patterns. Maybe, yeah, not maybe, but also positive ones and critical thoughts. And I think this is where I see the big potential and what inspires me to stick with this and work with it. And other than that, I think another aspect that is important and that we are working on a lot is the question of interdisciplinarity. You kind of have to work together with other people from other fields. And I think that if you create with a group, the results are always more interesting and relevant.
But Nora, if I could just continue with you, for you, artificial intelligence is also a vector for messages. In other words, it's through artificial intelligence that you want to change the narratives. You want new narratives. You want it to be more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, in the cases of my recent and my now projects, yes, but it's not even bound to machine learning, I would say, because a project that I did a few years ago was the so-called Nefertiti hack that was based more on scanning and digital artifacts itself. So what I'm trying to do in all of those cases is more looking at the emancipatory potential of the technologies, looking at maybe the backdoors those technologies can offer us as individuals, as the public, to engage and activate collections in a different way than really just visit a museum and look at objects or listen to people representing objects in a very certain manner. And I think, this is now with machine learning, like another project, for example, was a chatbot. It is interesting to listen to our own thoughts uttered by a machine. And what difference does it make to us? Yes, this is what I like to play with. But on a more serious note, I think it's actually something that allows us, that means maybe more grassroots and activist movements, also to engage in a dialogue that then can be very visible and can be played out online, for example. And the digital is as important as the analog today. And many museums, because what is a museum, and those I'm talking about are like classical collections that are rooted in imperialism, basically, and they didn't really change that much, even if they have all those digital assets or digitized objects. They really don't know what to do with it. But now we have different means of engaging here.
Now, Adrian, you're currently traveling in India and Bangladesh. Do artists you meet there share your vision of artificial intelligence in art? Is there a cultural difference that you see?
It depends where I am in India and Bangladesh, because it's like very diverse here. So at the beginning, when I was first in Bangladesh, in Dhaka and Chittagong, and over there I gave like talks at the universities where one professor said, "I think it's the first time we hear about AI." You know? So I think he was a little bit exaggerating, but if you look at how the faculties and schools work, even in graphic design, they have like computer rooms, but everybody is using still is like not using the computers. So it was, in that sense, for me, it was like difficult to find any artists or a bunch of artists in Bangladesh. But then in Bangalore, for example, it's like it's the total contrary. Basically, there you have, you know, the techno cities around the old town, and over there I was like giving talks to people who knew, of course, a lot more than I, because I hardly know anything about artificial intelligence. So over there you have quite a different scene, where you have art and science and art and AI and art and technology very closely working together. And I think it's the same here in Goa. because also a lot of artists have moved here during the pandemic. So you have a lot of artists also working with generative art, specialized in sound experiments and so on. So yeah, it really depends where you are, you know. But I think in general, what I notice is that you have, in a way, a lot of extremely highly talented people here with a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and also a lot of curiosity in terms of just mixing things up and exploring what one can do with these different kinds of technology.
We have a question from one of the people who are following us, so I will read it. It's actually for Nora. It's from Anne-Laure. Thank you very much, Nora, for a very inspiring presentation of your work. You spoke about how the neuronal network process collective memory and allows to grasp a quantity of images that we could never humanly process. You then referred to the collective unconscious. Would you say that the new images that you are creating could allow us to glimpse at archetypes?
That's a good question. I never thought about it that actually how I get the output is really more an infinite possibility of versions based on their finite and defined set in but yes, it could be some form of type, but maybe that's not how this latent space, because it's true, I said it's based on the essence of the images that we do as an input, but then I think the power of the architect, I don't think that this is like what those neural networks at least are programmed for, but I'm sure actually, now that I think of it, it's also possible to, because you can also do very different calculations with the same neural network. And depending on what you, like how you put the vectors, what you want to see, basically the results will be different. So probably if this would be your hypothesis to try to find the archetypes, that must be possible. But that's not in this case what I was looking for. It was really more pondering through the different possibilities and forms of the images, like Bildsprache, of the language of the images.
Well, Anne-Laure answers exactly what archetypes are. Always in potentia, she says.
Always in?
Potentia. I'm not sure exactly. Okay. That's what she writes.
Yeah, wonderful.
You also talk a lot about in your work, Nora, techno heritage. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means? Does it mean that through techno heritage we are given back what has been maybe taken by collectors or museums during colonial history? But aren't you kind of doing the same thing with the data that you're gathering today to work with artificial intelligence?
Yes, as I'm definitely appropriating the data sets from the museums. So I'm stealing something that is already stolen, that's for sure. But no, honestly, what I mean with techno heritage is a bit more broader of a concept, I guess. It's more the question between the original and our like obsessions with the original objects that I personally don't share. So this is why I work like that. And I believe, like many people, especially like in different generations, they can't really relate to it as much anymore as it used to be. although it's not really true, because even in the past we had like beautiful exhibitions only of copies of objects that were sufficient and were fascinating for the audiences at that time already. So no, but what I'm looking at is a bit the field of like tension between the actual objects that are a bit out of reach these days for the regular. Oh, it's so sweet. There was the donkey in the background. And okay, there's nothing like against an animate object. It's a beautiful species that we can't really clone, luckily. No, but the question of the data of the object against the object itself, this is what I'm interested in, and my working assumption is that the digital is no slave to the original anymore, but it has its own life, and it has its own object biography itself, and it can do actually many more things. Because when you think about it, like museums are very limited to, they are not open for the world, because it's impossible that every person of the world will go to that space and look at the object and the questions also, if that's necessary. And this is what I mean also with techno-heritage. And of course, in my context, it is this aspect that emancipates us and liberates the objects from those very neo-colonial museum structures. Yes.
Adrian, what is your view as a curator? Does it pose ethical and moral problems for you as a curator?
What exactly? Nora's work?
In terms of you know, sort of making, I guess the big word is deep fakes, I guess. Does that pose problems for you as a curator in terms of, you know, ethics and morals?
No, not really. I mean, we had this discussion in the project that we're doing now with Nora and some master students and PhD students and postdoc experts, and I think it really depends on what kind of deepfake you do, you know. And over here we had like also this legal discussion about if it's a defamation of somebody, if you put words into their mouth that makes them look bad and so on. So in that sense, there are clear legal, there's a clear legal context, which is not even an ethical question. You know, it's clear when somebody is defamated or how to say, just remember the German word. So I think, yeah, it really depends on how you use it.
Can I add something also? It's actually, I don't think it's so different towards painting or photography, because also there you need sometimes the consensus of the people who are in the picture, and the same is true for machine learning. But what I find conceptually as an artist very fascinating with machine learning, of course, are the possibilities to cross those boundaries, and there are still many gray zones that are not enough discussed, and also there is not really a solution to it. We can see the problems of deepfake in our today's politics all over the place, and that we haven't figured it out yet. This is certainly a bit different towards, I think, photography, but we are getting there. Just for really conceptually, how can I say that? I mean, what you can do with a deepfake or with synthetic video production, basically, is you can steal someone's identity in a new way, in a way that it looks like animated, basically. And this is very interesting, I guess, for many artists already.
Obviously, artificial intelligence has taken over many parts of our lives. In the art world, we're just beginning to see how far it can go. Is it a disturbing factor? Is it, as we say in French, un grain de sable, or anarchy in the art world? Is it a disturbing factor that's going to change everything? Is it what the art world needs? I know I'm asking a lot of question in one question, but I'd like to hear you on that because it's going to be our last question. I don't know who wants to answer first.
Yeah, maybe one other note. It's not a direct answer to your question, because I just thought usually when we discuss those ethical issues in machine learning or even in artworks, it goes to a like more dystopic vision of what's possible. But this is not what I'm looking for and what I'm interested in, even, because that we all know. But on the contrary, I think there is a big potential for using deepfakes as an inspiration, as more a utopia, like a dystopia. And this is something that needs to be explored much more by many more people. And it's more difficult, I think, to propose something positive and forward-looking than to criticize and to point towards what's not working or what harm can be done. Yeah, this is just a side note. And maybe this is also something for the art world to think about.
Adrian, what are your thoughts?
I would maybe say that what is interesting about AI, and not just in the context of art, is that it will affect all of society, or that it is affecting all of society, and that there is at the moment, as far as I saw in this new context for me, also a high awareness of this, that one tries to really think of it in a holistic way. And I think in that sense, as much as AI is affecting our society, as much it will affect also art. And I don't think that it will, I don't know, there's this, like Nora was saying, there's this utopic hopes or dystopic hopes in how it could change our society. But I always said it a couple of times in the last 2-3 weeks, it's always, there's still the human, and basically still the human is the problem. It won't be, AI won't solve the problems that we have of equality, of, the rich and the poor and so on. So yeah, and I think if you look at society and the implication that AI has on society and in art, it might be like a same average. There would still be painters and performers using non-AI. Sometimes they might use it, sometimes not. So I think it's not a renaissance, as somebody said in Bangalore. The question was a renaissance of art, thanks to AI.
Okay, so AI, not the renaissance of art. Some might disagree, I don't know, but thank you very much.
Maybe can I ask, like, what I think could be interesting also, because of this time frame I've used, from industrialization to today, it's also this idea of creativity and the genius and so on. So hopefully AI can help a little bit in getting rid of this idea of creativity and genius, and which doesn't mean that we get rid of artists and art, but that this kind of hardcore individualism on genius and authorship and so on might be dissolved a little bit more thanks to AI. So that's like a hope.
That's a very optimistic way to end, a hopeful message, and a great way to end this conversation. Thank you very much to the both of you. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. I know in difficult conditions for Adrian. Thank you. And we will see you next time for our next ArtTech Conversation. Thank you very much.
Bye.